The silence hung heavy, broken only by the deliberate steps of Richard Hayes as he entered, his face devoid of emotion. Tension rippled through the room, palpable in every sharp intake of breath and shifting glance. Across the courtroom, Emily Carter sat motionless, her eyes locked on the man who had eluded justice for so long. Her grip tightened on the bench, the years of anger and sorrow etched deeply into her face. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone present, the atmosphere electric with unspoken anticipation. "This trial will reveal what has remained hidden for 10 years, the prosecutor began, their voice steady and commanding. The announcement of new evidence sent a wave of whispers through the courtroom, curiosity and disbelief mingling in the air. A recorded confession was presented, the culmination of painstaking work to unearth the truth. Emily felt her heart race as the significance of this revelation settled over her. The years of doubt, of waiting for answers, suddenly felt justified. Richard's alibi had been flawless, unshakable. The details were recounted: the charity gala, the witnesses who placed him there, the meticulous timing that left no room for suspicion. For a decade, it had silenced questions and directed blame elsewhere. But cracks were beginning to show. How could something so airtight hold up forever? Questions lingered, each one pulling at the threads of the carefully constructed story. People would revel in the revealed secrets. It seemed clear that the other's intentions had little to do with peace. The sight of Richard, older but still composed, brought a fresh wave of pain. Memories of Jessica's laughter, her warmth, and the bond they had shared flooded back, only to be replaced by the hollow ache of loss. The calm exterior Richard maintained was maddening. How could he sit there, seemingly untouched by the devastation he had caused? Emily's anger burned quietly, fueling her determination to see justice finally served. The story rewound, unraveling the events that had led to this moment. Jessica's vibrant personality filled the room as memories surfaced of her joy, her kindness, and the spark that had once defined her. But beneath the surface lay shadows. The cracks in her marriage, the subtle signs of control and manipulation, the quiet fear she carried, all came rushing back. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and the unraveling of Richard's alibi had only just begun. Emily Carter's thoughts often drifted to her sister Jessica, a constant presence in her mind. Their connection had always been strong, built on shared secrets and unwavering support. Emily had admired Jessica's warmth and resilience, a light in their family. But that admiration now felt like a heavy burden. She replayed their last conversations endlessly, searching for signs she had missed, hints of the struggles Jessica had kept hidden. The guilt was a shadow that never left her side, a reminder of promises unfulfilled. Emily's relentless pursuit of the truth wasn't just for Jessica. It was for her own redemption. Jessica's disappearance left a void that nothing could fill. The events of that night were shrouded in mystery. She had walked out the door after an argument with her husband, Richard Hayes, and never returned. The search for her felt like a race against time, but with no clues and no leads, it became a frustrating dead end. For Emily, giving up was never an option. She refused to let Jessica's case fade into obscurity. While others moved on, she clung to the belief that the truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of lies and deception. Richard Hayes was the kind of man who could win over any room. His charm was magnetic, his reputation spotless. As a prominent philanthropist, he was seen as a pillar of the community. To most, he was the grieving husband, struggling to cope with an unthinkable loss. But behind the perfect image, there was another side to him. Jessica's marriage to Richard had been far from ideal. He controlled the narrative in their relationship, his subtle manipulation leaving her isolated and dependent. His alibi for the night Jessica disappeared, attending a high private ex-charity gala, was flawless, supported by dozens of witnesses. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that his charm was a mask, hiding something far darker. Jessica had always been good at hiding her pain. Beneath her cheerful demeanor, there was a quiet vulnerability. The pressure to meet societal expectations, combined with Richard's overbearing presence, had chipped away at her confidence. Her growing feelings of inadequacy in her marriage became more apparent in the months leading up to her disappearance. Richard's dominance overshadowed her, leaving her feeling small and unheard. Jessica's isolation was a silent cry for help, one that Emily now recognized but hadn't acted on in time. Richard's public image was one of perfection, a devoted husband and respected figure in the community. Privately, he was a master manipulator. He had a way of making Jessica doubt herself, keeping her reliant on him. Hints of his control emerged in the smallest interactions, his veiled threats disguised as concern. He created an environment where Jessica felt trapped, her independence eroded piece by piece. Emily began to see the full picture, one that painted Richard as far from the man he pretended to be. Emily's guilt was a constant companion, driving her to uncover the truth. She spent sleepless nights piecing together the events leading to Jessica's disappearance, replaying conversations and memories in search of answers. Her determination became an obsession, one that pushed her to confront resistance from family, friends, and even law enforcement. She refused to let Jessica's story end without justice, even as the pursuit took a toll on her own life. For Emily, this mission was more than seeking answers. It was about finding peace for her sister and herself. "How?" Emily Carter sat at her desk, poring over the statements from the charity gala. She had read them a dozen times, but this time, something caught her attention. Martha Daniels, one of Richard's key witnesses, had claimed she saw him leave the gala briefly to take a phone call. But why had her tone changed so drastically when Emily re-interviewed her weeks ago? Emily recalled their exchange vividly. "Martha, you said Richard stepped outside for a call. How long was he gone?" Martha had hesitated, her gaze darting away. "It couldn't have been more than a few minutes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily pressed further. "Did anyone else notice? Was anyone with him?" Martha's response had been evasive. I don't remember exactly. It was so long ago." Emily knew that hesitation meant something. The cracks in Richard's perfect alibi were starting to show, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. She had to follow up. Richard Hayes had always been a master of perception. His polished charm could disarm the most skeptical critics, and his ability to control a narrative was unmatched. When whispers of Emily's questions began circulating, Richard wasted no time spinning the situation to his advantage. "Ah, she's grieving," he told mutual acquaintances with a sympathetic tone. "Emily's always been passionate, but she's letting her emotions cloud her judgment." It worked. Slowly, Emily found herself cut off from potential allies. Friends who had once supported her began to distance themselves, wary of being caught in the crossfire. Even Emily's attempts to confront Richard directly were met with condescension. "Emily," he said one day when she approached him outside his office, "I understand your pain. Losing Jessica devastated all of us, but you can't keep tearing yourself apart like this. Let it go." Her anger boiled beneath the surface. "I'll let it go when I have answers, Richard." His smile never faltered, but his eyes turned cold. "Careful, Emily. Obsession can ruin people." Emily's investigation led her to places she never thought she'd go. Late nights at the library, digging through public records, revealed financial discrepancies in Richard's accounts. A hidden mortgage, unpaid debts, and questionable transactions painted a very different picture of the man so revered by the community. Her search also uncovered emails and phone records that hinted at multiple affairs. Messages filled with promises of secrecy and veiled threats of exposure made it clear that Richard wasn't just unfaithful, he was calculating. With every discovery, Emily's heart broke a little more for Jessica. How much had her sister endured before she vanished? How had she managed to keep it all hidden? Emily sat in her car, clutching the printouts of the records she'd uncovered. "You weren't just his wife," she whispered to herself, tears stinging her eyes. "You were his prisoner." And the accessories too, she thought. She struggled to clear her head, her brain swirling with all. Emily's single-minded pursuit began to take its toll. Her editor, once her biggest supporter, called her into the office. She left. "Emily, I get it. I do. But you're not reporting anymore. You're chasing a ghost. You've got deadlines to meet." She stood her ground. Jessica's case isn't a ghost. It's real, and Richard's hiding something. On reaching his destination, her editor sighed. And what happens when you burn every bridge you've got? Friends and colleagues began avoiding her calls. Even family members started pleading with her to stop. But Emily couldn't. The loneliness only fueled her determination. Every step forward felt like a step closer to justice for Jessica. While sorting through old family belongings one night, Emily stumbled across a box of Jessica's things. At the bottom, tucked beneath layers of letters and keepsakes, was a small journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the scent of paper and ink wafting up. Jessica's neat handwriting filled the pages, each entry more heartbreaking than the last. "Richard gets so angry when I question him," one entry read. "I feel like I'm walking on eggshells." Another entry stopped Emily cold. "Last night he grabbed my wrist so hard it bruised. I told him I was leaving. He laughed and said, 'You'll never leave me.'" But the final entry was dated the night Jessica disappeared. "We argued again. I told him I couldn't do this anymore. He said if I left, I'd regret it. I'm scared, but I need to get out." Emily clutched the journal to her chest. The fear Jessica had endured was palpable, and it only deepened Emily's resolve. The paranoia began subtly. A car parked across the street for hours at a time. Footsteps behind her on dimly lit sidewalks. Anonymous texts warning her to stop digging. "You're making enemies," one message read. The threats only sharpened her focus. She began looking over her shoulder, double-checking locks and avoiding isolated places. Fear crept in, but it wasn't enough to make her stop. Martha Daniels finally agreed to meet Emily, promising to share what she really knew about Richard's alibi. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Emily waited, her coffee growing cold as the minutes ticked by. Martha never showed. Martha's house had become Emily's haunted house once again. The next morning the news broke. Martha had died in a car accident, her vehicle veering off the road under mysterious circumstances. Her last words were, "For you, I will leave my son." Emily's devastation was matched only by her rage. She knew it wasn't a coincidence. Martha had known too much, and now she was gone. "Richard," Emily muttered under her breath, "you've silenced everyone else, but you won't silence me." Emily sat in the dim glow of her cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of files and discarded coffee cups. Her eyes scanned the grainy footage from the surveillance tape she had managed to retrieve from a nearby convenience store. The date stamp read the night of Jessica's disappearance, and her breath caught as Richard's unmistakable figure appeared on the screen. There he was, slipping out of the charity gala at precisely the time he claimed to be mingling with guests. The timestamp didn't lie, and neither did the direction he was heading. away from the venue, into the shadows of the night. Emily grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed Detective Marlowe. "You need to see this," she said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I've got proof. Richard left the gala." The tape reignited her resolve. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, and with this evidence, the tide of the investigation shifted. Greg Turner sat across from Emily in a dingy diner, the smell of stale coffee and fried food hanging in the air. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I shouldn't even be here," Greg muttered, his voice barely audible. "You're already in this, Greg," Emily replied, leaning forward. "If you want to make things right, now's your chance." He hesitated before taking a shaky breath. "Richard paid me. He gave me $5,000 to show up at that gala and act like I was part of the charity committee. Said all I had to do was mingle, drop his name, and vouch for him if anyone asked." Emily's jaw tightened. "And did anyone ask?" Greg nodded. "Couple people. I told him he'd been there all night. That's what he wanted, a rock-solid alibi. He said no one would believe a grieving husband could do anything like that." Silence. For the confession was damning, and Greg's testimony became the final nail in the coffin. End quote. The raid was swift and decisive. Armed officers stormed Richard's sprawling estate, their presence breaking the serenity of the manicured grounds. Richard emerged from the front door, his expression a mixture of shock and indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice ringing with authority. But his bravado crumbled as investigators began uncovering evidence. In a hidden storage room, they found items Jessica had been wearing the night she disappeared: her bracelet, a scarf, and even her purse. Each piece was like a ghost from the past, screaming the truth Richard had tried so hard to bury. As the items were catalogued, Richard's confident facade gave way to visible cracks. His carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse, and there was no escape. Jessica's voice trembled as she confronted Richard in their living room. "I can't do this anymore, Richard. I won't live like this." Richard's face darkened, his charm replaced by cold fury. "You think you can just walk away from me? After everything I've done for you?" The argument escalated, voices rising with every accusation. Jessica moved toward the door, but Richard's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. The struggle was brief but violent, ending in a horrifying silence. Richard stood over Jessica's lifeless body, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do. Under the cover of darkness, he loaded her into his car and drove to a remote location, far from the prying eyes of the city. As he buried her, he repeated the same words to himself, over and over. "No one will ever know." The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Richard sat at the defense table, his composure carefully rehearsed. But as the prosecution began their cross-examination, the cracks started to show. "Mr. Hayes," the prosecutor began, their voice steady, "you've claimed you were at the charity gala the entire night. Is that correct?" "Yes," Richard replied, his tone clipped. The prosecutor clicked a remote, and the surveillance footage played on a large screen. Gasps echoed through the room as Richard's figure was clearly seen leaving the gala. "Can you explain this, Mr. Hayes?" Richard's face reddened. I stepped out for some air," he stammered. "And yet you didn't mention this before," the prosecutor pressed. "Why is that?" As the questioning continued, Richard's responses grew increasingly erratic. Finally, in a moment of frustration, he let slip a detail only the perpetrator would know. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The weight of his admission hung in the air, and in that moment, Richard Hayes's carefully constructed lies came crashing down. The air in the courtroom was suffocating, thick with anticipation. Every eye was fixed on the jury foreperson, who stood with a sheet of paper in trembling hands. "We find the defendant, Richard Hayes, guilty of murder in the first degree," the foreperson declared, her voice steady despite the ripple of emotion that followed. A collective gasp spread through the room, followed by murmurs of relief and subdued tears. Emily Carter sat motionless, the weight of those words sinking in. Justice, elusive for so long, had finally been served. Richard sat at the defense table, his once arrogant posture reduced to a shell of defiance. He avoided Emily's gaze, the realization of his defeat etched into every line of his face. Later, Jessica's remains, discovered in a desolate woodland, were returned to the family. At the burial, Emily stood at the gravesite, a bouquet of white lilies in hand. Her voice broke as she whispered, "You're home now, Jess. Rest easy." The fight for justice had consumed Emily's life. Her sleepless nights, filled with fear and frustration, had left deep lines on her face and a heaviness in her heart. Sitting in her small apartment, she stared at the stack of documents and newspaper clippings piled high on the table. The culmination of years of effort, all for a single moment of truth. And yet, a gnawing guilt remained. Why hadn't she seen the signs earlier? "You did everything you could," her close friend Lauren told her over the phone. Emily sighed. "But I should have been there before it was too late. She was slipping away, and I didn't notice." The thought lingered, a constant reminder of the cost of her crusade. Yet amidst the grief, there was strength. The woman who had doubted herself for so long now carried the knowledge that her perseverance had uncovered the truth. Emily opened her laptop, the blank document glaring back at her like a challenge. She began typing, her fingers hesitating only briefly before the words started flowing. Jessica Carter was more than a victim. She was a sister, a daughter, and a friend whose life was stolen by the very person she trusted most. The story poured out of her. Jessica's life, her struggles, and the systemic failures that had allowed Richard's alibi to stand for so long. Emily's writing became a catharsis, each word peeling back a layer of her pain and transforming it into something meaningful. The book wasn't just for Jessica, it was for every woman who had been silenced, for every family who had been told to move on without answers. "Marcia, I'll make sure the world remembers you," Emily whispered, staring at Jessica's photo on her desk. The fallout from Richard's conviction rippled far beyond the courtroom. The charity that had provided the gala alibi faced intense scrutiny. Investigative reports revealed a history of mismanagement and questionable ties to wealthy donors. Donations plummeted, forcing its leadership to resign amid public outrage. The once celebrated organization now stood as a symbol of complicity and corruption, its reputation in ruins. Detritus Baptism, one of America's 10 largest churches which transformed the landscape. Meanwhile, Greg Turner, whose confession had been pivotal, received a reduced sentence for his cooperation. The decision sparked heated debates. Some argued he had redeemed himself. Others believed his involvement in the cover-up should have carried a harsher penalty. Emily watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. While the truth had been exposed, it had left a trail of destruction in its wake. Justice had a cost, one that everyone involved would carry. A cool breeze swept through the cemetery as Emily stood before Jessica's headstone. The bouquet she had placed there weeks ago was beginning to wilt, but she hadn't replaced it. Something about its fragility felt fitting. She traced the engraved letters with her fingertips, her mind flooded with memories, the laughter they had shared, the fights that seemed so trivial now, and the bond that nothing, not even death, could sever. End of poem. "I hope you can forgive me, Jess," she said softly. "I wish I'd been there sooner." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. The journey had been grueling, but it had brought the closure they both deserved. As she walked away, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. "We did it," she whispered. The weight of the past lifted slightly, and for the first time in a long while, Emily allowed herself to think of the future. Emily sat by the window of her apartment, the rain streaking down the glass like tears. The journey to uncover Jessica's truth had been harrowing, filled with moments of despair and fleeting hope. The lies Richard had woven were intricate, his manipulations so seamless that even seasoned detectives had been misled. She thought of the years wasted, the countless nights spent chasing shadows. How easily truth had been buried beneath wealth and influence. It struck her how fragile justice truly was, how easily it could be swayed or silenced. But Emily also knew that seeking the truth, despite the pain it brought, was worth every sacrifice. Exposing the darkness that had stolen Jessica wasn't just about justice. It was about restoring her sister's voice. Richard's ability to avoid suspicion for so long was a testament to the insidious nature of privilege. His money, his connections, and his charm had built a fortress around him, one that protected him from scrutiny and deflected blame. "People like him always have a way out," Emily had once told Detective Marlowe. "They know how to play the system." Marlowe had nodded solemnly. "It's not just the system, it's society. No one wants to believe the charming husband could be a killer. It's easier to believe the victim was somehow at fault." Emily shivered at the thought. How often had the same dynamics played out in other cases, with truth sacrificed at the altar of convenience? How much injustice had gone unnoticed because no one dared to challenge the powerful? "What are we willing to overlook?" Emily whispered to herself, "just to keep our illusions intact." As Emily revisited Jessica's journals, she saw the subtle cries for help scattered throughout the pages. They weren't explicit, but they were there, in the hesitations, the self-doubt, the longing for escape. Jessica had been silenced by fear, by shame, by the belief that no one would believe her. Emily closed the journal and stared at the photo of her sister on her desk. "You deserved better, Jess. You deserved someone to listen." The weight of that realization became a call to action. How many more lives could be saved if people recognized the signs, if they chose to confront uncomfortable truths rather than ignore them? Jessica's story wasn't just a tragedy, it was a reminder of the cost of silence. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Jeff Mitchell, Southwest Missouri. The cemetery was quiet, the morning air heavy with dew. Emily knelt by Jessica's grave, placing a copy of her newly finished book against the headstone. The title gleamed in bold letters: "The Lies We Bury, Jessica Carter's Story." She traced the engraved name with her fingertips, her voice trembling as she said, "I promised I'd find the truth, Jess, and I did. We did." Emily stayed there for a while, her thoughts drifting between the past and the present. The book wasn't just her story, it was Jessica's, a way to ensure her sister's voice would never be silenced again. As she stood to leave, she glanced back one last time. "Rest now, Jess. I'll make sure no one forgets you." Walking back to her car, Emily reflected on the toll the journey had taken, not just on her, but on everyone involved. The investigators who had poured their energy into the case, Greg Turner, who had faced his own demons to confess, and the community, forced to reconcile with the truths they had ignored. Justice, Emily realized, wasn't clean or simple. It came with compromises, with pain, and with the knowledge that even doing the right thing could leave scars. But despite the cost, she knew it was worth it. Justice was messy, but it was necessary. The story of Jessica Carter was proof that truth could prevail, even against the odds. "This suffer," Powered troubled. Across the mouth of the Carter Valley was the farmhouse again, and turning on the ignition, Emily whispered, "No matter how hard it is, we can't stop fighting for what's right." As the car pulled away, the sky began to clear, the rain giving way to sunlight. A quiet reminder that even after the darkest storms, light could break through.